Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here and actually to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart. As a matter of fact, I was originally trained as an agronomical engineer, briefly flirted with plant biotechnology until I sold my soul to the evil social sciences to basically understand why people disagree about things that for me as a straightforward scientist and based on my science background didn't make much sense as far as debate was concerned. So I got really interested after working for 5 years for Accenture in the management consulting issue, that realizing that knowledge and information and explaining to people what the science was all about wasn't enough for me to actually make a difference in the policy realm. So basically, I got interested in the issue of genetic engineering. I did my dissertation starting with some people actually around the room studying the construction of the controversy in a large number of settings, starting in the United States, but we also work in South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, India, and the Philippines. So really getting a broad sense in an applied context of the complexity of this debate when it plays on different societal contexts. So I was asked today with Stephen here to give you an overview of public opinion about genetically engineered as applied to food and agriculture. And as you saw and as you heard this morning, everybody's talking about public opinion. All the speakers, to some extent, talked about one dimension of this issue and why is it a challenge very often to think about public opinion in relationship to science, science expertise, science policy, and more generally speaking, scientific debate. So just to set the stage so we are all in the same context here, and to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the vast majority of Americans, actually vast majority, a big portion, a third of them, actually doesn't care. I mean, we need to actually know that. So we have here actually quite a nice normal distribution here with, you see here, and look at the trend from different public opinion polls starting 2007, going to 2014. You know, like roughly 10% very much supporting this technology, roughly 10% very much opposing the technology, and roughly the rest being in the middle. Nice curve here, which is not surprising. That's how much technology and much adoption of technology play out when they are in the society context. You have very vocal minorities, either pro or con of something, that are going to be very adamant about their attitudes and actually talking about that. And the vast majority, us included, we don't have time. We don't have energy. We don't have actually willingness. We don't have interest in actually investing cognitive energy, intellectual energy to actually make sense of that. And we go on with our life, our everyday life, as we should obviously be doing. So what does it mean then when we think about genetically engineering? What do we mean by that issue? And again, it's something that it was interesting for me this morning. I realized that we haven't defined what we talk about. What are we saying people disagree about? Well, most of the time when we think about that, people think about food-related issues or environmental-related issues. As a matter of fact, most of the time when we think risk and benefits related to G, that's what we think people care about, and we may be correct, and we're going to think about that later on. And Bill did mention very, convincingly that indeed these are important things to think about. However, if you think of genetic engineered crop as a larger issue, and you think of the dimensions that they entail, you may think regulatory issues. Do we have actually the safety mechanism to make sure, the biosafety mechanism, to make sure that actually, citizens are protected? This was a really important point in Mali. Kenya cared a lot about this. India actually struggled with this at some point. China is thinking about that. In the United States, this is coming back into the debate too. Do we think in terms of people being concerned of the distribution of the risk and benefits? Well, Europe certainly are concerned by the monopoly-related issue, the idea that, 6 or 7 big corporations seem to actually own the technology. And when they think GE crops, they don't think technology. They think modern agriculture, what it represents, how is it perceived, what does it mean as far as farmers in that country, etc. Others, Zambia, would think international trade issues. If they actually adopt the technology, they cannot actually export to Europe. So for here, to some extent, the dimension of the issue is extremely different. Are we talking about consumer choice? Is the label the issue about consumer having the right to choose where they're eating? Very different. Again, potentially connected to food safety, potentially not. Are we thinking in terms of impact on rural developed communities? What will it mean for small-scale farmers? Again, a sociological question that is very different from the one I have talked about before. And again, you know, like the last one we haven't talked about, that also will come up in different focus groups, is that the issue of nature tampering. Do we have the right to mess up with things that are at the small scale? Because after all, God has created nature the way it is. This is something that people will bring up and comes up to with surveys and focus group and other type of social media methodology when you ask people their attitudes and how they feel about this issue. So, okay, a complex issue, a multidimensional issue that goes beyond food and environmental safety, that may prompt people to think in terms of things that we haven't thought about, that we may actually be talking about something else. This being said then, what is this about the science that makes us all in this room? Why is it controversial? Well, I think Dan eloquently told us that this is an issue that actually goes beyond science and has dimensions that are not only technical, scientific, but social, ethical, legal. This type of science for which people will actually debate, and I think it's healthy that we debate, and it's actually great that we have this workshop. It is a question of engagement and actually come up with something that will satisfy a lot of parties that are around the room, that may have different ideological views as far as is, this issue will play out in the society that they are, living in. It could be political ideology, it could be religious ideology, and so on, for which competing interests and competing agenda are trying to actually win the debate. In the the studies of science, we describe that as, like the player's agenda, where everybody, imagine a stage where other actors are there and they're competing to actually kick out everybody else from the stage. This is what happens with controversial science. Everybody will have their own interest and agenda, and rightfully so, try to win the debate. So it will be debated in the public sphere, and it's certainly something that we shouldn't avoid. Healthy debates is what happens in democratic societies, and you do want to have all those interests to be represented in that public sphere. However, let's remember, though, that the debate, and I think both Bill and Dan, and actually Roger too, pointed out that it will depend on the time where you are debating the specific technology. It's linked to the social, cultural, and political climate in which the technology is evolving. Again, Kenya, different. France, different. United States, different. Within United States, differences. Midwest versus, let's say California, just to point to different social, cultural, political contexts. Alabama versus Maine. Let's think in terms of the social, political, cultural context in which this debate takes place before coming up with general conclusions and assumptions about what we need to do or not do, or why and how we should meaningfully engage the public. There is potential for polarization. This is clear, and this is the nature of this type of issues. I mean, nanotechnology is not very different. Let's face it, synthetic biology will be another one of these issues that will generate this kind of debate. So it is a climate of controversy, but unlike my friend and colleague Dan Kahan here, I am more hopeful. I think that actually communication has a role to play. And I think the challenge for all of us is actually understanding what it means and how you can do so in a way that actually promotes meaningful public engagement and not shy away from doing it. As actually Roger was saying, we're all brokers here. By standing up and talking to you here, although I am a scientist, I am part of the debate, I am a player, and I need to be conscious that whatever I say has potentially an impact on how people would perceive the issue. So what impacts public attitude toward GM then and other novel technologies? I told you about the social, political, and cultural context. And let's talk a little bit about the information climate here, because a lot of people, and I know that we will have our journalistic colleague here talk a little bit more about that. A lot of people focus very often on individual level characteristics. How is political ideology of one citizen, make an impact in how they may perceive a specific technology, and so on. So I'd like to address the information climate, because the purpose of this talk is not to go into sociology of why scientific controversies actually unfold, although I would strongly advise everybody that's interested in that to actually seek this literature that's actually extremely interesting. So the public opinion climate in the United States. This is an open-ended question that asks people what are their main concerns about genetic engineering as applied to food and agriculture. And again, on prompt, and it was hard to find polls that have comparable questions. The main thing indeed comes up to be health-related. Environmental problems come second. The fact that they perceive it's not tested, it's actually here, and you can see that ethical concern here comes as the next one, but taste is mentioned. And interestingly enough, and I think this is something that may have changed now since this was in 2013, in 2012 and 13, the issue of labeling was actually not quite mentioned. So that, to some extent, acknowledged the fact that I was telling you that it really is related to a specific time in a specific social cultural context. So what the research tells us, why people feel that way? I think something that you heard several times this morning is that idea that actually knowledge makes a difference. People feel a certain way because they don't know enough. I think decades now of social science research has debunked that idea, and we call it the myth of more information. We call it the deficit model. We can call it whatever we want. The idea is, though, that when you actually model public perception of biotechnology and as applied to food and agriculture, as we do in my lab, at the end of the day, knowledge level really accounts for a very small amount of the variance in public attitude. So it may, depending on who, the other potential components of the model that you have, but it's not the main determinant of how people feel about the issue. As a matter of fact, we again and again, and I think people have convincingly pointed that to you early on, mental shortcuts and heuristics will actually be more important as far as explaining why people feel a certain way, either pro or against the technology. And I'm going to talk about some of those mental shortcuts in a second. So that information climate indeed provides those contexts, provide those shortcuts because they may be readily available. So, but they're not the only one again. And when I talk about information climate, don't get me wrong here. It is, to some extent, media messages, like the overall, let's say, tone of the media, but it can also be marketing messages. And here we're going to have my colleague here that will talk more about this in a second. That will be very important in influencing consumers and other individuals. It can be science fiction films. We haven't talked about that at all, and it would be another type of talk. It could be educational messages, like the type of deference to science that instilled in school and that may actually foster people to feel a certain way. So what's also true from a social science perspective and communication perspective is that media messages and frames that appear in the media can have a very important role as far as producing that mental shortcut that people need to actually make sense of issues that, after all, are complicated. And I think Dietram Scheufele really pointed to that very clearly when he showed you the type of shortcuts we can take to interpret a message. And it was interesting to me to see that this kind of thing was used in a scientific journal. Like when you think that actually mental framing in media messages are mainly, portrayed through visuals and headlines, the scientists here did a good job as far as their genetic engineer helping keep harpoon toxic out of barley. I'm not quite sure if they think that that image will actually promote positive attitude towards the technology. And I would encourage my colleagues, the scientists, to talk to me about risk communication at some point. And then we have rough about that before. Media frames can be powerful, and I think Dichon talked about that by saying how Greenpeace has really well understood that. This helps people make sense of the issue. As Stefan will point out, though, most of the frames we see that are powerful tend to be negative. We don't have a lot of positive frames out there that could be used as mental shortcuts by individuals that try to make sense again of that issue. Nobody likes to be vaccinated, I'm sorry. Nobody likes this type of thing. Powerful frame. A beloved monarch butterfly here will be the case study that we're going to talk about tomorrow. Obviously, like the emoticon here, everybody knows now what it means, I think eloquently. Those are the type of shortcuts that can be portrayed through different media frames. However, and there's something else that I would like you guys, sorry, you're not in my class today, I'm jet lagged still, sorry. Another thing that I would like you to remember is, number one, knowledge doesn't really matter. Number two, framing does matter in a positive or negative frame. And number three, that the same given frame can mean different things to different people, because we filter communication messages through a lot of mechanisms that won't be talked about today, but they are important to take into account. Who are we talking to? How do people actually react to that frame in relationship to who they are, to who they heard, to their worldviews, to their political predisposition, to their interest in science, and to a lot of different filters. And I think Dan Kahan mentioned the cultural worldviews, important to take into account, that will make people react differently to a different frame. But media frames that do not operate in a vacuum is really something that we need to remember. So let's say the National Academy of Science produces a report, and they distill that report of 400 pages in 10 pages that will be used by different audiences. Those 10 pages will be framed a certain way. No matter what, how much we try, all information is framed. There's no unframed information. The question is, how do we do this in order to actually promote meaningful public engagement by whoever is going to read that report? Actually ask for some thought and potential some social science research. And also, media effects do not happen only through framing, and I won't, do my media effect 101 class here, but basically scientific information indeed can be framed into different type of media packages. They can also promote what we called in communication research, so spiral of science type of effects, which mean a very vocal minority can end up being covered more and more in the media and being, through interpersonal discussion and stuff, to the extent that people will end up thinking that that minority actually represents the majority, and end up silencing the one that actually do not have the same opinions. Important thing to think about. Cultivation is something that's important. The more we watch entertainment media, the more we actually are embedded in a specific portrayal of reality that people end up thinking is the real one. And the most famous illustration of that is that people that watch a lot of TV end up thinking that the world is a meaner place than it actually is because of all the violent acts that they see on TV. This is also something that's been actually shown in the context of science, and I have a colleague here from Cornell that has been investigating this kind of thing with us. The last thing that I want to talk about the information climate is also who shapes the policy debate. Media are only one of the actors that we need to think about. Like in the context of genetic engineering as applied to food and agriculture, policymakers obviously, and the reports I was talking about are one of the actors. Research and academic institutions with the press release also are part of that information climate. Extension staff, farmers group, industry, and we're going to hear more about that, activist group, consumer groups, and ultimately the consumer themselves, when they talk with their colleagues, their family and others, are all shaping the debate. So we shouldn't say communication doesn't matter. It matters, but it matters in all those levels. And all those levels, to some extent, need to be aware of potentially the frames they use, the type of medium they use, the type of debates they generate with what they talk about in their context. So law information public, we heard it. We heard also cognitive miser, etc. I think all of us social scientists in the group agree that us included, we don't like to think all the time. And so we're going to make any effort we can not to think, which means we're going to use shortcuts. We're going to use everything we have in our power to devote as little cognitive energy as necessary to make decisions about anything that we need to make decisions about. And this is healthy. It would be very tiring to think about. How much information do I need to decide? I'm going to use really the little one. Again, the best decisions that I made as far as buying a car usually are the ones that I made without thinking too much. Did you know that? Social science proves that, actually. How do media around me covers that, and how do I interpret what they do? How does the interpretation fit my beliefs? And all the other values that I bring on the table are things to think about. So I'm going to conclude here with just a few words about individual characteristics. I mean, I gave you a laundry list of different things that impact public attitude toward genetic engineering. But I think we really need to keep in mind the fourth message here. Knowledge doesn't matter, frames matter. We all actually take shortcuts, and this is healthy. And we all brokers in that scientific debate about genetic engineering. Is that idea that risk, perception of risk, is not determined by hazard. The fact that the quantitative, that the probability of us being hurt by something is very low doesn't mean that it doesn't anger us. That's why, actually, Peter Sandman came up with that term, outrage. So it's not about hazard, it's about outrage. Hazard is how much this is going to be, hurting me, right? Outrage is how much is this angering me, how angry I am after you do that. And as a matter of fact, genetic engineering has all the qualitative dimensions that you would encounter in a technology that would anger you. It's very small. Somebody else is doing it. You know what's the most dangerous technology that we're using all the time? A car. A car can kill so many people, that big car. We have traffic law, we have a belt, we have all that stuff, but it's still very dangerous. Well, we choose to drive the car. We actually see benefits from driving a car. It's really cold in Madison, I tell you. I'm happy to have a car. And we see, all those things that we are in control. Genetic engineer, again, it could be another lecture, has all the qualitative dimensions that make people be outraged. Let's face it, this is the case. And perception of benefits or no benefits are actually very important. This is research that was conducted in Europe.